911 operators, what call scares you till this day? I have one. I worked TMS while my friend was dispatched for this call. I was second, so I never got to interact with the person in question, but I listened to the 911 recording after. Got called to do backup for gunshot wound initially. Farm out about 20 to 30 minutes outside of town. Turned out to be a father who recently lost both his parents within the month. Didn't want his family to go through with such loss either. Decided to kill his family to spare them that same fate. Father killed mom, 2 kids. We get a call from the daughter who's about 13. She's been shot in the head but is still alive and conscious. The call was about 30 minutes long, but the father was in the same room as her and the rest of the recently murdered family members. She was sitting on her bed with a bullet in her head, just saying in the most monotone voice, "I've been shot. My family is dead. My dad has a gun." Just in so much shock that she couldn't express an emotion. You could hear long pauses of silence as the dispatcher tried to get an idea of the situation and how the daughter and dad were just staring each other down for 5 minutes at a time with nothing but breathing to be heard and the daughter answering the dispatcher's questions. About 30 minutes go by of dispatcher going, "Are you alright? He's still there? He still have the gun?" etc. and just monotone responses. You can hear the sound of sirens in the background and the father leaves the room followed by a gunshot. The dad shot himself and died right as we were pulling up. She ended up living, but had lost every single member of her family that week. I don't know what happened after all that. That call is the reason I never wanted to pursue dispatch ever again. My friend was an absolute champion for how he handled it, but he never wanted to listen to it again. I shadowed a 911 operator. We got a call from an 8-year-old who said his big brother was in the bathroom and hasn't been out for an hour and there was no sound. He broke the door open somehow while he was on the phone with us, and his brother was dead from suicide, hanging. This was small town, and a year prior that same older brother had called, and when the mom had committed suicide herself on pills. Hearing that kid cry will always haunt me. I decided not to become a 911 operator. It was my second week, and I was plugged in with another dispatcher who was handling calls, and I was working the computer and stuff as part of my training. We got a call from a guy in the car, who said that he was in a near accident with another driver, and the other driver was following him and being aggressive. The dispatcher told him to turn around and look for a well-lit, busy place, like a gas station, to stop, and we would have someone on the way to meet him there. He was shot 5 times while on the phone with us, waiting for the officer to arrive. I found out the next day on the news that the guy flew in from out of town to walk his daughter down the aisle. A month or so later, at the beginning of my shift, I received a call from a very distraught man whose dad had gone missing from his care facility. He had dementia and his dad thought he might be looking for a bar to get to drink. I took his information and got the description, and put out a bolo for him. For these calls, we normally don't find out the outcome. In this case, one of my last calls that same night was a person calling who found a body on some train tracks. And it turned out to be the same guy I had put out the bolo for. I had to call the deputy who went and took the guy's statement and tell him the news, and he then had to go tell the guy's son. That was a shitty end to the night. Former 911 operator here. Sometimes the calls that stick with you aren't the most physically traumatic. I once had a call from a 17-year-old kid who came home from a sleepover to find that his mother had moved, just packed up his sister and everything in the house and left while he was gone with no forwarding address or information. She also turned off his cell phone that morning, so literally the only number he could call was 911. He was trying so hard not to cry and his voice was shaking as he kept apologizing to me for calling 911. He just didn't know what else to do and had no other family. She also took everything, so all he had was a couple of things that he had taken to the friend's house. He told me his 18th birthday was in a couple of weeks and he literally had nothing. The officers that responded took him to a shelter. I think about him often and I hope he's okay. Even if he was a kid who got in trouble or had behavioral issues, I can't imagine coming home to find your mother has abandoned you. That's exactly what happened to me. I was actually allowed to stay over at my friend's house for the weekend. This was absurdly rare as we were a strict religious house. His parents drove me home and were there when I discovered an empty house. They temporarily took me in for a few months thankfully, but I was completely on my own from there. I eventually tracked down one of my brothers. He told me that because I refused to follow a life with Christ that I was not part of the family. I was 17 at the time and 35 now. The entire thing ruined me to the core. I have never trusted anyone since. I can't maintain any kind of personal or social relationship and general just don't do well with people anymore. You know, the fucked up part is that my childhood was not a happy thing at all, but I miss my family more than anything. I would do anything to see those people that hate me so, like a kind of fucked up Stockholm syndrome. I responded to a suicidal person on a Thanksgiving morning. He was there with the cops, trying to get the cops to shoot him. Cops tased him to keep from harming himself or anyone else. The guy was on something unconfirmed because he found the strength to power through the voltage and initiated the process of taking his own life. He finally went down and was placed on my stretcher. I was trying to control bleeding but it was to no avail. The man looked me square inches in the eye and took his final breath. I'll never forget his face. Edit to fix autocorrect of tasted to taste, because that would have been awkward. We just had a sequence of suicides in our city. Oldest brother of 3 killed himself, then a year to the day the youngest brother shoots himself in the family's house, with entire family home. Parents and remaining 2 siblings are wrecked. Not exactly relevant but this is super recent and was extremely close with the both of them. Scary things. Edit. Lord, so many responses. I am heartbroken and send my love to all of you. I for one have struggled with issues in the past and had my moments, but never was one to take my life. I still at my lowest of lows held highest my love for life and hoping to see another day. But this has truly brought awareness to me about the fact that when one person commits suicide that past the morning we have to keep in touch and show as much love and care to the ones they left behind. I study a lot of things and especially human behavior and I am honestly understanding this chaining of suicides to be a real relevant thing. Again my heart goes out to all. I was not expecting anyone to have much to add to this let alone so much. Stay strong all, no matter how dark or grim things can be, don't lose hope, and fight to love and live and embrace life, good or bad. There is so much more than to end. Your story is once in all of existence to be had. Make it something for all to remember. Fight. I had one like that. Teenage boy said he was in his room playing video games and came out to his mom on the couch, foam around her mouth, and he couldn't wake her. I had the kid doing chest compressions but I'm not sure he even realized what we were doing and why. Likely overdose. I felt that one though because I could put myself there as a teenager who just spent my evening playing video games and coming out finding my mother. Never fun. This happened to my neighbors when I was a kid. Mrs. C had dementia, possibly Alzheimer's, and Mr. C was like a third grandfather to me. We hadn't seen him in a week so my mom went over to see if they were okay. Mrs. C told us Mr. C was still asleep, so my mom called 911. I'm glad we didn't go in there because apparently Mr. C had passed in his sleep a few days before and Mrs. C didn't realize. Very sad for us. But I'm very grateful for the police officers who were so kind and made sure a little kid like me didn't have to see the details. Great memories of him, though. He taught me a lot about gardening that I still use today. Not a dispatcher, but did a welfare check with a very similar scenario. Elderly brother and sister who lived together. Sister took care of brother as he has dementia. Her friends hadn't heard from her in a few days and couldn't get a hold of brother. So they called us. Brother was polite, cordial, and let me in. First door to my right, I see sister in her bed, eyes open, sunken, and the lights are out. She's obviously gone and has been for a bit. Brother just kept stating that she was taking a nap. Got a 911 call with just screaming, nothing intelligible, just the loudest screaming you've ever heard. I started officers to the house. Then a kid started yelling that her uncle was trying to kill her, her sister, and her grandmother. She started screaming again. There was a thud, and then no more sound. Officers got there and a man walked out into the driveway and said, "I did it. I killed them." He was mentally ill and lived with his mother. She had been trying to get him committed, with doctors saying he wasn't a danger to himself or others. His 9-year-old twin nieces were visiting from out of state. He snapped that morning, bludgeoned them all with blunt objects, including a large vase. His mom and one niece died. One twin survived with extensive injuries. It was a horrifying call. You did the right thing sending an officer to the house. When my mom was flipping out, the 911 operator kept saying I called the wrong dispatch. Like, bro, I'm currently on the phone and holding my mother back from attacking my dad and brother. You need to help me out here. I was on a landline and they said I was out of their jurisdiction when I called back the next day to complain. I told them in an emergency situation, you need to have a backup plan for when that happens, and contacted the Secretary of State over it. A little off topic, but your story reminded me of mine. Family member worked as police dispatcher, received a call from an elderly woman. Her husband had just been killed in their garage by an intruder. She heard it happening. She's wheelchair bound but phone was next to her. She frantically begged my family member to help her. While he was on the phone with her, the criminal cut her throat. My family member stayed on the line 3 more minutes until cops got there. He could hear the sounds of the attack, her gasping and gurgling noises. He kept telling her help was coming and to hold on. Amazingly, she survived. Criminal was later caught, a 17-year-old who just wanted the thrill of killing someone and picked them at random. He's on death row now. I was a 911 operator. When I asked for the address, I got an angry man yelling, "Just get the fucking ambulance here." When I asked what happened, the caller said, "You don't need to fucking know that. I just need to know what happened so I know who to send and what equipment to bring. Sir, just send a goddamn ambulance. My kid's having a seizure. Don't send any fucking police." Don't send police coming from a caller is basically them telling on themselves. Please send police, because the patient or the EMS crew or both could be in danger. So I passed a note to my partner, who was dispatching. "Send PD." Extremely uncooperative caller. I tried my best to get through the rest of the questions. How old is the kid? Are they conscious? Are they breathing? Has the seizing stopped? Etc. I got nothing but verbal abuse. All I knew was that a pediatric patient had a seizure when the call started. There was yelling in the background, and there was some terrible yelling in the foreground. I'm going to do another one because this thread is bummer and we all need a laugh. I assure you, not making any of this up. There was a ranch on the edge of the city limits in my area, right by a large park and swimming hole. That ranch had a variety of livestock, but they had an issue with their pygmy goats. Every few weeks we'd get a call because 100 little goats were roving through the park or down the street. One day, I took that call from a man in the park who had been chased by the goats into a porta potty. He was frantic, like, screaming, "You need to send animal control out here right now." And all the while, I could hear 2 other prominent, repeated sounds, the whack of little goat noggins rattling against the plastic porta potty, and bleating. Malevolent, incessant bleating. What did those goats want? What would they have done, had he not found refuge? We'll never know. Edit, typo fix. I wasn't, but my dad's longtime GF was a 911 operator. She was an absolute angel on earth, but she had the most heartbreaking stories. Worst I can think of was an older woman who called 911 because her husband had locked himself in their bedroom and refused to come out. Despite her begging and pleading, the lady exclaimed, "He's in there and he has a gun, please hurry." While the operator was trying to keep her calm and talk her down, she heard the unmistakable pop of a gun. I can't imagine the wailing on the other end of the phone after that poor lady had to listen to her husband committing suicide through the door. Nearly 30 years ago, my grandma was a widow living in a Florida retirement community. The landlords allowed a man in his early 40s live in the community despite strict rules regarding age minimums. He ended up going on a drug-induced rampage, stabbing his son and girlfriend. My grandma was getting her mail and he chased her all the way back to her doorstep and stabbed her over and over. She managed to crawl back into the house and call 911. We listened to the call during the trial, and it was absolutely one of the hardest things I've ever had to sit through. You could hear the man screaming outside the house. The 911 operator was very calm, trying to keep my grandma alive till help arrived. The guy took off in a stolen car and headed towards Georgia, going the wrong way on the highway. My grandma was airlifted to the nearest hospital and barely survived the attack. 370 stitches, including on both sides of her throat and all over her head. I firmly believe the calming, caring urgency from the dispatcher helped keep her going. Not scary, but I think about them often. Mother of 4 called in saying the trailer was on fire and her bedroom door was locked from the outside. I could hear her kids screaming and coughing in the background. I asked her if she could open a window, but they were nailed shut for some reason. Then we had her shove blankets under the door to stop the smoke from coming in before the fire department gets out there. After about 5 minutes the coughing dies down and she stops responding to me. Nothing at all. Then the fire department comes over the line saying the homeowner came out and that no one else was inside so we could slow the ambulance. We kept telling them we're on the phone with people inside, but they assured us there was not. Eventually they pulled the people out. Mother and 2 of the kids died. The man who came out was letting this family stay with him and he torched it and left them in there. Second was a woman calling on her husband while they were fighting. She was screaming saying he was in the room and had a gun and wasn't sure if he was going to shoot her or himself. Seconds later I hear a gunshot and blood-curdling screaming. I asked who had been shot and she said he shot himself in the head. Impossible to get that 1 minute of chaos out of my head, and it was months ago. I have 2. A call from a male who stated he'd found his girlfriend's son unresponsive. Very frantic caller. He and the mother passed the phone back and forth multiple times while I tried to give various rescue instructions. That part wasn't all that abnormal, but they later took the male into custody and they found out the initial caller had strangled the kid and then freaked out and called. Still makes me mad, and it's been years. Not mine, but a call they played for us in state training. An elderly man had a complete psychotic break and killed his wife with a hammer. Afterward he calmly called 911 and confessed. That dispatcher attempted to give rescue instructions, up until he realized the damage was extensive enough that her head was mostly gone. Several of the first officers on scene were violently ill because of how bloody the house was. Apartment fire. Woman burned alive on her balcony because she was too afraid to jump. The screams over the radio of the fire crews trying to rescue her. 20 minutes later we get a call for a young man that walked in front of a dump truck on a highway to take his own life. While crews were responding to that, a 10-year-old girl who hung herself was found by her mother. I was still quite new the day all this happened, but I will never forget what I heard that day. I work for the equivalent here in the UK. Not my call. One from a training session we had going. An elderly gentleman had called 999 as he was feeling faint, tight chest and struggling to breathe. He wasn't in the house on his own. His son was downstairs, but he wanted to call in private due to his son being a worrier. He collapsed mid-call. The operator frantically dispatched somebody to go around and help. However, in the process of this, the sounds that man was making were horrific, almost like a squeal, then turning into a grunting, high-pitched groan. I genuinely can't explain it. He sadly passed away by the time the crew had arrived, down to a massive heart attack. His son didn't even know what was happening until the police and paramedics turned up. Safe to say the son was devastated, and hearing him scream was just as bad. His son sadly killed himself a month later. Former Leo had a dispatcher that needed some therapy after this one. Rural County Sheriff's Office is where we worked. Dead of winter. Roads were slick with a glaze of ice on top of the driven-on, hard-packed snow. A rural mail carrier had lost control of her vehicle and rolled her Jeep Grand Cherokee on its top. Due to her delivering mail, her window was open, and during the crash the vehicle had rolled on top of her arm. She was pinned but managed to call 911. While en route, We could hear the panic in our dispatcher voice when she said the vehicle had caught fire. On a summer day it would have taken us about 15 minutes running lights and sirens. Due to road conditions it took about 30. Every time my dispatcher keyed up on the mic to give us further information, I could hear the screams from the caller. By the time we got there she had expired. Our dispatcher listened and tried to talk to this woman while she was burning alive. She was absent for like a month while she got everything sorted out. I think of both of them often. Not scary, but will definitely stick with me for the rest of my life. Answered a 911 call about an unresponsive male driver passed out at a stop sign. I got the info and dispatched units to the scene. Realized moments later that the vehicle the caller described was my own. It was my 26-year-old son who had overdosed on heroin and Xanax. He was at a road literally 100 feet from dispatch and EMS. We made it there at the same time. Narcan saved his life. Currently in rehab for the next year, and is rocking it.